Good evening. Good evening. You'll be asking questions later, so get warmed up. Good evening. I'm Dennis Kress. I'm the Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities, and what a pleasure to see so many people out on Wednesday evening for an academic lecture. So how many are here for the title? Okay. This is the fourth lecture in this year's really fascinating series from the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology on sexing science and gendering technology. When Dr. Brown and Dr. Groman came to me with this year's title, I, as usual, was incorrect in doubting that it would be interesting or draw many people. So I said, make it interesting. And Matt certainly took the challenge. To the point that, yes, turn off your cell phones. Given the title, you may leave your pacemakers on. And any of you 18 or under need to be sitting next to a parent or adult. I want to say a few words. It's very, very rare that I have a chance to introduce a colleague as a lecturer. And take a moment to both introduce and thank Matt Brown. Matt has served for the last 6 years as the director of the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology. And Magda, who's out working, has also been the associate director for that time. It is, I think, one of the most important organizations in the university. This is a university dedicated to studying science, advances in research and science, to promoting technology and creating advances in technology. And any university dedicated to such advances and development needs to have a corollary dedication to thinking about why we do it and what its implications are. The center's goal is to examine and evaluate the implications culturally, ethically, and aesthetically about science, technology, and medical advances. And not just evaluate and examine them, but improve them. It's a noble goal. It's a vital part of this university. And Matt and Magda have done a superb job in growing it, in administering it, and in making it intellectually significant. So before you get to applaud Matt for his talk, I want you to Matt Brown is assistant professor, I'm the dean, not for long, it means he's going to be promoted and things are going to be really good around here. Philosophy, his interests span philosophy, psychology, cognitive science, theories of mind, ethics, the work of John Dewey. In other words, he has that kind of expansive, embracing intellect that's perfect for the University of Texas at Dallas. He also surely knows how to give an intriguing introduction to a character whom I have a great deal of affection for, Wonder Woman, and can't wait to hear him talk about love slaves and Wonder Women, values, social reform, and the psychology of William Moulton Marston, my colleague, my friend, someone whom I admire as an intellect, Matt Brown.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Okay, let's start with this 2-page excerpt from an early Wonder Woman story. This is Wonder Woman number 4, April, May 1943. The story is called The Rubber Barons. This two-page story gives a flavor of what's going on, or something that's going on in those early 1940s Wonder Woman comics that I want to talk about tonight. Even though Wonder Woman only plays a very minor role in this little excerpt, it's an important one. So we start, Wonder Woman is talking to Elva. Elva has a love interest named Ivar Torgson, who is one of the aforementioned rubber barons. So Wonder Woman is showing Elva an X-ray photograph of Torgson's subconscious, which they showed on the previous page. It looks like this, right? So he's the rubber king and she's his slave and so on and so forth. And she says, "So that's the way Ivar thinks of me. Why, I can't even believe it." Most men secretly think of women that way in this man-ruled world, Wonder Woman says, but I have an idea. We can cure Ivar if you'll help. So Wonder Woman begins an experiment to reform Torgson. She puts the costume on Elva to make her look like a queen, and you need to make him think of you as his queen in his subconscious mind instead of his slave. Then you must learn to control him. But how? First dress like a queen, then act the part, and with my magic lasso, make Ivar submit to your wishes. He'll love it. When he's learned to enjoy being your captive, you can control him without any lasso. Wonderful, if it works. So Elva's task begins. Queen Elva, I give you this slave. Subdue him. These secret subterranean rooms, which Wonder Woman has for some reason, are completely furnished for your use, including a cell for your captive. In 3 days I will return. Adieu. The slave at first rebels bitterly against feminine control. This is absurd, ridiculous. What a fool you're making of me. And Elva tells him, I'm making a man of you. Learning to submit is the final test of manhood. Ivar discovers, to his amazement, that he enjoys being the girl's captive, right? He doesn't want to escape. It's amazing. And then in the evening, she locks him up until tomorrow in a cell. On the second day, she doesn't even need the magic lasso. He's learned to enjoy submitting, so she no longer needs to compel him. And he says, so long as you keep me as your slave, I'll always submit. He follows her around like a dog, ardently proposes marriage to Elva. She agrees, but you'll still remain my slave, she says. But suddenly, a flood of prehistoric feminine feelings overwhelms Elva's untrained mind. She's not an expert at this business, so she wants to take his chains off. He begs her not to. No, right? But she does it, and as soon as she does it, as she submits to Ivar's domination, his male conceit instantly returns. You fool, you should have kept me bound. You had me going, but you're a weak sister, like all women. So he pushes her down, she bonks her head, and he grabs Wonder Woman's magic lasso, lays in wait, and as you can imagine, further hijinks ensue until Wonder Woman saves the day. Okay, so what's going on here? Now, I hope to show you tonight that this is actually a piece of a very interesting and philosophically significant puzzle about the relationship between science and values. But to do that, I first need to tell you a little bit more about Wonder Woman's origins. Right? So Wonder Woman first appeared as a backup feature in All-Star Comics, number 8, December 1941. And in January 42, she became the lead feature in Sensation Comics. And in summer 1942, we saw the debut of a comic devoted exclusively to Wonder Woman that was published quarterly. Now, in these early comics, Wonder Woman's creator was credited as Charles Moulton, but this was actually a pen name, which was pretty common in the industry at the time. The pen name was created by combining the middle names of the producer of the comics, Maxwell Charles Gaines, and the creator and writer of the comics, William Moulton Marston. So in order to understand what's going on in that comic that I showed you, what we need to do is learn a little bit more about William Moulton Marston. This will help us understand what that has to do with psychology or social reform or radical feminism or any of that. So who was William Moulton Marston? Born 1893, died young in 1947. He was an academic psychologist by training, and in his early part of his career, he was trained at Harvard by a psychologist named Hugo Munsterberg. who himself had been brought into Harvard to run the psychology program by William James. Munsterberg had been trained in Europe under Wilhelm Wundt. So if you know anything about the history of psychology, you know this is a very reputable scientific lineage. Wundt and James are basically the founding fathers of psychology. So that's one part of the story. Marston is known as the inventor of the lie detector test. He developed specifically a way of measuring, supposedly detecting deception using systolic blood pressure measurements. And his testimony featured in an important federal court case, Fry versus United States, which actually the results changed the way the courts dealt with scientific experts and expert witnesses. And the Fry rule, which reigned for decades, was created in this case. Not in a way that was positive for Marston, but that's another story. Marston was also a radical feminist, what I might call a gynocentrist, who argued for women's political, social, and material independence, and who claimed that women ought to and probably would one day rule the world. Marston was also polygamous or polyamorous. He was married to Elizabeth Holloway, who became Elizabeth Holloway Marston, and he also had a long-term live-in relationship with Olive Byrne, and he had children by each woman. They lived together as a big happy family. Both of these women were well-educated. They both had graduate degrees in psychology. They were frequent collaborators of Marston in his scientific work, sometimes credited, sometimes not so much, to the point where it's actually, we talk about Marston's psychology, that's a little bit of a misnomer because Olive Byrne and Elizabeth Holloway played a huge role in helping him develop it. We've also learned recently from new work on Marston by people like Jill Lepore that his feminist political lineage is actually quite strong as well. Both Elizabeth and Olive were strong feminists in their own rights, educated, as I said. Olive Byrne was also the daughter of a woman named Ethel Byrne, who was the sister of Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger being, among other things, Ethel and Margaret together, big force in the early days of the birth control movement. Margaret Sanger founded the organization that was later renamed Planned Parenthood, and it's a major part of early feminism in America. Another interesting personal connection, not really related to feminism, but also interesting, via Marston's aunt, a woman named Carolyn Keatley. Marston was deeply interested in and connected to the works of Levi Dowling, who was the originator of the Age of Aquarius, right? The kind of original New Age sort of free love sort of movement. So, so why did a prominent psychologist create a superhero character? In a letter, kind of late in his life, to one of the earliest historians of comic books, a fellow named Colton Waugh, he wrote, "Wonder Woman is psychological propaganda for the new type of woman who should, I believe, rule the world. There isn't love enough in the male organism to run this planet peacefully." So, key word there, psychological propaganda. If we want to understand what that means, we need to understand some of his psychological research. And women should rule the world. Is that some form of feminism? What kind of view is that? Another part of this story is about the relationship between science and values. Marston's work in psychology is an example of the influence of values on science, including how that influence can sometimes work for the betterment of science. It's not always necessarily a kind of bias. Values have an important role to play in science, and part of Marston's work exemplifies that. There's also a story about the influence of science on values as Marston worked, especially later in his career, to use his scientific theories and techniques to change the culture of his time. So Marston was a prolific publisher of psychology textbooks and journal articles. Here are his two book-length works, which were published in the International Library of Philosophy, Psychology, and Scientific Method, which was a pretty major publishing venture. He was clearly an accomplished scientist, and his focus was primarily on the nature of emotions and on consciousness, the nature of consciousness. His lie detector work was in some ways an application of his ideas on these broader topics. So he starts off very early in his major work on emotions, the emotions of normal people, with this statement. I submit that the backbone of literature has been transplanted intact into psychology, where it has proved pitifully inadequate. Now, note to my friends who are in literary studies, he's not dismissing the importance of the value of literature. Rather, this quote captures his idea that when it comes to scientific psychology, we need to reject our common sense notions about how the mind works and replace it, like the kind of poetic language that we get in romantic literature. And we need to replace it with a scientific set of terms and concepts. He's got in mind sort of standard typologies of the emotions. This is just an example drawn at random from contemporary theories of emotions. These theories tend to take for granted some of our common sense emotional concepts like rage, terror, joy, amazement, amusement, and treat them as scientifically real states of the mind. Right? Marston thought this wouldn't do. We need to drop these kind of folk concepts and replace them with genuinely scientific ones. So one part of what it means to be a scientifically respectable concept for the mind for Marston is that they needed to reflect the normal state of a healthy mind. Right? The basic mental building blocks of the mind are parts of a healthy individual, or what he called a normal individual. So for him, this meant two kinds of things. One, when we're talking about emotions, that meant they were pleasant and harmonious. And when we're talking about the emotions, they need to contribute to what he called maximal efficiency of function. They had to be a kind of part of the biological creature operating at full capacity. Marston was an avid consumer of the neuroscience of his day. You can see a lot of diagrams of this sort in his works. He himself, he drew a lot on the work that was being done in the early 20th century in neuroscience. He was also himself mainly an experimental psychologist. So brain structures on the one hand and experimental experiments on the other hand were the key for him to constructing psychological concepts. In some ways, he was like the contemporary neurophilosopher Paul Churchland, who argues that our common sense psychological concepts are false, radically false, and will eventually be replaced, according to Churchland, by categories that come straight out of neuroscience. Now, there's a little bit of difference here. Marston thought that neuroscience was a crucial part of the picture, but unlike Churchland, he wanted to maintain psychology's independence from neuroscience. So in his way of thinking, doing that meant picking out a basic unit for psychology that was different from the basic unit of neuroscience. So just as physics has particles, chemistry has molecules, biology has organisms, and neurology has the neuron, right? Psychology would have what he called the psychon as its basic unit, or sometimes he called it the integrative unit response. Okay. And on this basis, he posited what he called the psychonic theory of consciousness as the fundamental theoretical framework for psychology. His use of the word consciousness here is intentionally a bridge to earlier work by people like William James and Wilhelm Wundt, who talked about consciousness, and explicitly trying to distance himself from more recent work by behaviorist psychologists like James Watson, who didn't want to talk about consciousness at all, or Freudian psychologists, psychoanalysts, who wanted to emphasize the unconscious mind rather than the conscious mind. And Marston actually devotes a significant amount of work to sort of showing that consciousness itself is an experimentally verifiable reality. Okay, so this psychon, what is a psychon? A psychon exists in the synapse, in the integrative activity of a synapse, right? The junction between neurons, of which I've drawn a crude cartoon here. So when signals from excited neurons, right, in Marston's way of thinking, this is not too bad, they send electrical excitations down to the synapse, right, which then creates an electrochemical excitation, and then that excites or perhaps inhibits, depending on the way the connections work, another neuron. We'll say it excites this neuron, okay? So that activity that happens in the synapse, that's a psychon for Marston, the way it integrates signals coming from different neurons further up the stream. So for Marston, right, the brain, right, may be made up of neurons, right, that's true. It's the functional organization of the brain versus these synaptic connections that makes up the mind. This is actually a strikingly contemporary idea in some ways. I think Marston would have really glommed on to neural network theory, the use of functional magnetic resonance imaging technology that focuses on the functional structure and interconnections of the brain. Okay, so how does this have anything to do with the emotions? Well, for Marston, the basic building blocks of emotions are these kind of interactions. He focused on dyadic interactions between what he called the motor self and the motor stimulus, right? These are signals in the motor neurons that eventually generate physical movement. Again, this is a cartoon, but you get the idea. So a motor self signal is a self-driven state, like maintaining muscle tone, maintaining equilibrium, sort of basic internally driven impulses. And the motor stimulus is a response to some kind of change in the situation, whether it's internal or external. So a motor stimulus might come from an environmental stimulus that's perceived. It might come from an internal stimulus, like a thought process or a decision that causes the motions of the body to change. And the simple interactions of this kind are what he called primary or basic emotions. Okay, so that's all very abstract. We're getting to some more concrete details about what his basic emotions were. So we set up this diagram with the motor stimulus and the motor self and the different interactions between them. There are 4 kinds of interactions depending on whether the motor self and the motor stimulus are antagonistic with one another or whether they're going in the same direction, whether they're allied, and then which is stronger, right? So the first of his basic emotions he called compliance, right, which is an antagonistic stimulus antagonistic interaction where the stimulus is stronger. So a scolded child falls in line, is experiencing compliance emotion. Right? He also thought an overwhelming aesthetic experience, right, which overwhelmed one's activity, was a kind of a compliance emotion. That was a big part of it. Second basic emotion is dominance or domination. Here, a child throwing a fit is experiencing a domination or dominance emotion. Competitiveness in business is driven by dominance emotion. Inducement is a non-antagonistic emotion, one where the stimulus and the self are allied in the same direction. So a baby reaches out to be picked up. That's trying to induce a behavior out of someone else. It's an inducement emotion. Leadership in a cooperative enterprise, as opposed to a competitive enterprise, would be based in an inducement emotion. Seduction would be based in an inducement emotion. And then lastly, submission, right? Following the instruction of a just teacher or guardian would be an example of a submission emotion, where, again, there's an alliance between the stimulus and the self, but the stimulus is stronger. The stimulus guides behavior, but in a non-antagonistic way. And these emotions are basic in the same sense that the primary colors are basic, according to Marston. So he was, I think, the first psychologist to compare the primary emotions to the color wheel. He didn't have color printing then, but you get the idea. More complex emotions then would be either mixes of the primary emotions or dynamic shifts between the emotions. So let me give you some examples of those. This is how complex emotions are built. Here's a dynamic shift, right? So an ordinary sequence of emotions would be the sequence from compliance to dominance, right? You start off, there's a strong, threatening stimulus, right? And the normal, healthy experience is to try to get away from this stimulus, to try to reassert one's control over the situation and move into a position of dominance. Right? An abnormal, unhealthy emotion is one in which instead the compliance emotion totally takes over. It's a state of over-compliance, and that dominance emotion recedes from possibility. Right? So if something is scary and threatening you and you just kind of collapse, right, in fear, that's another kind of emotion, but it's an unhealthy or abnormal emotion. Combinations, on the other hand, of submission and inducement are what he called love emotions. There's a spectrum of love emotions based in those combinations. And those combinations of compliance and dominance are what he called the appetite emotions. If this looks at all familiar to you, this ringing like vague bells, this kind of theory actually had a second life after Marston. These categories, DISC, in personality typing. This is still used today in certain management circles to determine personalities or leadership styles. They've changed some of the more scandalous names, right? So submission turned into steadiness, for example. But basically, this is still used, although Marston didn't himself use the view in this way. All right, so that's a complicated and kind of strange, a little bit abstract psychological theory. What does it have to do with values? What does it have to do with the role of values in science? Well, there are several moves that Marston makes on the basis of this sort of basic view that I think show an influence of the feminist values that he has on his scientific inquiries. Right? So I'll take you through a few of those. Right? First, what Marston called the love emotions, those inducement and submission-based emotions, he thought they were primary in our sort of emotional life, our emotional economy. And for a healthy life, those emotions had to be in the lead, right? And the appetite emotions had to be subservient to, or as he says here, adapted to those love emotions. Right? Part of this has to do with the antagonism in the appetite emotions. That antagonism has a component of unpleasantness. On Marston's conception, emotions need to serve pleasantness, harmony, biological functioning. So the appetite emotions with their conflict and unpleasantness had to be subservient to the love of emotions. And the feeling of pleasantness really bears this out, he thought. So he says, nature intended the love elements to control self-gratification. I think he means that a little bit metaphorically, but nevertheless, nature intended the love elements to control self-gratification. It's the only hope, he says, for human evolution. He goes so far as to say love is the ultimate end of all activity. And this is not just a philosophical claim. This is a claim about what it takes to be psycho-emotionally healthy, or as he said, normal. And I think we can see the connection with his values here in the sense that this emphasis on harmony and love over conflict and appetite privileges traditionally feminine values and associations, right? So if we think of kind of this traditional stereotype of masculine involving conflict, feminine involving harmony and love, it causes us to rethink and revalue those values, those concepts, right? Which is one common trope in feminist thought. A second element of his work here, which is interesting, is his critique of the psychoanalytic tradition that started with Freud. He was a trenchant critic of Freud and the psychoanalysts. And some of these criticisms were interesting, right? Were perhaps fairly incisive. Now, Freud and his views are somewhat notorious for their sexist ring, right? The concept of penis envy as a driving force in female psyche is one that regards the male condition as normal and the female condition as abnormal. His views on sexuality, sexual intercourse, are pretty regressively sexist as well. The female is passive, the male as active, right? The sperm is active, the egg is passive, all that sort of stuff. Marston's critique of psychoanalytic theory emphasized Freud's focus on conflict as a driving factor of human psychology. Recall just from a moment ago, Marston's idea is that the basic functions of psychology need to reflect the healthy mind, and the healthy mind is one in a state of harmony and efficient, proper biological functioning, right? Aiming primarily at love, right? And not just the antagonistic aspect, but also the lack of a sufficient concern for bodily mechanisms. Here, I'm thinking primarily of behavioral and also neural mechanisms were a major flaw for Marston. That's interesting. Marston never calls out Freud for being a sexist, right? So he doesn't make that part of his critique explicit, but I think it fits a common theme from the history of feminist science that those who hold feminist values or those who have feminine experiences can come in with their very different perspective, in this case on gender, and uncover assumptions or flaws in the work that others are not able to recognize because they share the basic assumptions and perspectives of the people proposing those theories. Okay, so anti-Freud, that's another one. Here's a third place where Marston's values interact with his scientific thinking. Key to his view of psycho-emotional health is an account of what he called love leadership, right? So not only is love primary, according to Marston, but it involves this notion of love leadership. Love is an essentially non-symmetrical thing, right? It consists of a pairing of what he called active love and passive love. You remember from our diagram a moment ago, love is a combination of this inducement and submission stuff, right? Now, according to Marston, when two of the basic emotions mix at the same time, right, one of them has to be primary or active, and the other has to be secondary or passive. So for example, if you have inducement-led love emotions, that's active love, and it's what he calls captivation. That's his term for inducement-led active love emotions. Passive love, then, is submission-led. Right? He calls this passion. So these emotions have to complement one another in a relationship. So he says, active love requires the person captivated, must be a willing, wholly submissive captive. Yeah, it's exciting. Okay. And Marston, another interesting element, Marston believed he had scientific evidence that showed that only women were really capable of active love emotion in a sufficient quantity or quality to be called love leaders, right? He thought there was a biological mechanism which provided women with the ability for active love that men lacked. So the only possible candidates for love leader training were therefore women, right? So there's a kind of biologically essential sex difference here. But it's one that involves a complete reversal of our attitudes about the strength and status of women. Here we see Marston saying that women, not men, are the more capable leaders, the emotionally stronger sex, because of their capability for active love. He says no concept of women's emotional status could be more completely erroneous than the idea that women are the weaker sex. Okay, and then finally, this training for love leadership became, in Marston's eyes, an ambitious program of social reform that he called emotional re-education. This is the final chapter of that book, The Emotions of Normal People, which up to this point is pretty much a big theoretical treatise on the nature of emotions. Here we end with an ambitious program of social reform. I think re-education didn't have quite the negative connotation it has today. And the goal was psycho-emotional health of individuals and of society as a whole. Part of the program of emotional re-education is educating women to be love leaders. And he articulates these 4 requirements for love leaders. We already talked about the first. He thinks that women are the ones who have the necessary capacity for love. But there are 3 others that speak to the social and material and intellectual conditions of love leadership, right? And key to this program is women's education and self-sufficiency. Standard feminist goals for creating equal status, equal opportunities for women, right? They needed to be self-sufficient, have the ability to support themselves. They needed to have knowledge about psychology, obviously, from William Marston, and they needed practical knowledge of social and economic institutions so that they could play their role in organizing society. Now, he comes at these relatively standard feminist goals from an odd starting point, right? For him, they're the preconditions of healthy people and society driven by love leadership. Nevertheless, these are crucial feminist goals. Okay, so that brings us back to this quote from the beginning. The program of emotional re-education that we saw from the last chapter of his book is what he was trying to accomplish with this bit of psychological propaganda in Wonder Woman. Now, is this really a recognizable feminist program? I think it is, okay? And I think it is, especially if we look at the feminism of Marston's time, right? So Marston's brand of feminism is very similar to that of Margaret Sanger, who we know he had a familial connection with, right? Sanger believed a lot of stuff, among them that birth control was even more important than women's suffrage in terms of the fight for women's rights, because lack of control over pregnancy was, in her time anyway, a clear path to continuing domination of women by men, right? If you get pregnant, then you're sort of trapped, right, by men. But more relevant to the core topic here, Marston believed that, Sanger believed, as did Marston, in the inherent superiority of women, in the superior moral virtue of women, right? Marston and Sanger are what historians and feminist theorists sometimes refer to as difference feminists, right? So rather than focusing on the equal capabilities and equal rights of women, they focused on the differences between men and women as an argument for giving greater rights to women. Right? They focused on how women would change society and change institutions by playing a greater role. And there's a long tradition of this. So Carrie Chapman Catt is an example who arguably fits this mold, right? She argued for women's suffrage not on the basis of the equal intelligence or equal stature of women, but based on women's different perspectives and how their inclusion in the political process would actually make politics better. Right? Charlotte Perkins Gilman also arguably fits this category. Her novel, Herland, is about an all-female, gynocentric utopia, not that different from the Amazons of Paradise Islands, to be honest. And more recently, Carol Gilligan, author of In a Different Voice, emphasized the different ways that women tended to think about ethical dilemmas as a way of trying to open up our understanding of ethics and society. Okay, so we've talked about the different influences of Marston's radical feminist values on his scientific work. Now let's go in the other direction and talk about the influence of science over values, right? Already the discussion of emotional re-education that we talked about gets at a program of ambitious social reform based on Marston's scientific thinking, scientific results. This program seeks to replace existing social norms and expectations, right? Either what your neighbors are doing or what they expect you to do, with a psychoneural norm for behavior, a norm for behavior that comes out of psychology and neuroscience. And I argue trying to enact this is precisely what Marston was doing in his subsequent career. Now, just about the time that The Emotions of Normal People was published, Marston fell out of academia. Jill Lepore, in her really rather nice recent book on this topic, uncovered that Marston was basically blacklisted from academia. She pulls out his letters of recommendation from the Harvard archive and shows that he was basically blacklisted by these letters of recommendation because of his nonconformist personal life, right? Because of his polyamory or whatever. Probably because of that. It's not completely clear. But same kind of blacklisting language that in the 1920s would have been written about homosexual people, right? Same kind of thing, right? So she points to the similarities in that language. This was a terrifying chapter of this book to read for me while I was waiting on letters of recommendation about my tenure case to come in. Same couple of weeks. Okay, so this story, I mean, this part of the story is in some ways tragic, but actually it also provided an opportunity for Marston to think about different non-academic ways of forwarding his program of emotional re-education, right? So he did this with he tried many different things. So one thing he did was he wrote 2 popular psychology books, or what we might call self-help books. Try Living in 1937, and March On, Facing Life with Courage in 1941. Try Living has this lovely frontispiece, which you may be able to read here. The light is coming in, and it's all resplendent, and it says, live, love, laugh, and be happy. The late 1930s was actually the kind of the rise of self-help as a genre, right? How to Win Friends and Influence People, I think, is published in this time period, and there's a few others. So it's really the rise of that genre. It's a really interesting moment, and Marston's there on the ground floor. Marston went to Hollywood and consulted for Universal Pictures for a brief time in the 1930s, on some of the great Universal Pictures horror films, among other things. And he at the time he co-wrote a book with Walter Pitkin called The Art of Sound Pictures, which among other things advised screenwriters on how to beat the censors state by state. You know, you can do this in Alabama, you can't do that in Maryland, so on. And also talked about how to incorporate Marston's views of gender and romance into scripts, right? Make convincing romance by making the women the love leader. Seems convincing to me. Marston wrote a historical romance novel, right? Originally titled Venus with Us, reissued as The Private Life of Julius Caesar. Just going to zoom in here on the back cover. I think you can kind of get the sense of what this story is about, right? From Egypt to England, from Greece to Gaul, he came, he saw, he conquered, but slave girl and vestal virgin, courtesan and queen, each in turn conquered Caesar. Nice. And of course, he created Wonder Woman, right? Here riding a mythical Amazonian kangaroo. So why would a scholar, a scientific psychologist, pursue popular culture, right? Film, dime store novels, comic books, as a way of getting his message across? This is something I've wondered about a good bit. There's this lovely quote. Jen Stuller quotes this in her book, Ink-Stained Amazons. This is Joss Whedon, the creator of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, who said, "If I made a series of lectures on PBS on why there should be feminism, no one would come to the party and it would be boring." Clearly this is false. Look how many people have come to the party. But the idea of changing culture is important to me, and it can only be done in a popular medium, or at least perhaps we should say it can be done particularly effectively in a popular medium. Okay, so let me now return to the Wonder Woman comics, look at some of the key themes and tropes in those comics, and see how they relate to Marston's unorthodox psychological claims and feminist ideas. Okay, so one much remarked feature of Marston's stories, and we saw this, I think, a bit in the earlier excerpt, is the use of bondage, right? You've got people being tied up, people being chained up, people in manacles, every conceivable way of binding someone up in these early stories. Here, these are just some representative examples. By one scholar's estimate, we see this kind of thing in about 25% of the panels in the early Wonder Woman comics. So maybe 6 panels to a page. That's more than one scene per page in the early comics of this kind of stuff. That's a lot of bondage. This is the kind of thing that leads like a comic historian like Bradford Wright to say, that Wonder Woman is not so much a pitch to ambitious girls as an object for male sexual fantasies and fetishes. Right? Wright is not so keen on the supposed feminist message of Wonder Woman. But I think when we read these scenes through the lens of Marston's theories, we can actually see that it's there's a little more to it. It's a little more interesting, right? We can make, I think, a distinction between compliance to a stronger dominator, right, which is sometimes seen in the comics, and the pleasure of submission to a love leader. We can, in fact, think of the comics as a way of teaching us how to make that distinction. Right? So the Amazons tie each other up for fun, right? There's all these games of bondage between the Amazon women or between Wonder Woman and her sidekicks at Holiday College, Etta Candy and the sidekicks, a whole nother talk. But then we see Wonder Woman berating these women for allowing men to put them in chains, right? Oh, you stupid girls, when you let your men bind you, you let yourself be bound by war, hate, greed, and lust for power, right? And in fact, a lot of the time when we see Wonder Woman in bondage, chained up, it's in order for her to break her own bonds, right? When we see in other comic books of the time women bound up, it's for Superman to come and save her, right? But for Wonder Woman, it's often for her to break her own bonds. Something totally different is going on in this scene from the comic I introduced the talk with. Here, right, Ivar is learning loving submission to a proper authority, right? And not it's not the same kind of scene at all as the earlier stuff. Another thing that's, I think, important in the historical context here, which Jill Lepore has emphasized very nicely, is that this kind of bondage imagery was actually very common in earlier feminist and women's suffrage illustration, right? So here's an example from Margaret Sanger's Birth Control Review, right, of a woman chained by unwanted babies. Here's an illustration by Lou Rogers tearing off the bonds of politics is no place for women, right? So this kind of imagery was quite common, and Harry Peter, who was the artist that drew Wonder Woman, hand-selected by Marston to draw Wonder Woman, had actually spent a lot of time in the 19-teens and 20s doing exactly this sort of illustration, right? This kind of feminist illustration in favor of the suffrage movement. So another major message of the comics that you see throughout these early comics is that submission to a loving feminine authority, right? Particularly the pleasure of submitting to a loving feminine authority, right? Because submission, remember, is part of love, right? Because the stimulus and the self are allied in that state of submission. It's an intrinsically pleasurable emotion. Here he is in the Emotions of Normal People saying, under no possible conditions can true submission be unpleasant. And you see that repeated throughout the comics. Here's Wonder Woman musing to herself, if girls want to be slaves, there's no harm in that. The bad thing for them is submitting to a master or to an evil mistress like Paula. A good mistress could do wonders with them. Right? So, I mean, two things there, right? She's making the distinction between loving authority and someone who's dominating in an evil way. She's also making the distinction between master full stop and evil versus good mistress, which I think is important here too. Because another major theme of the comics is the evils of male domination, right? Just consistent theme. This is a great little story where Steve Trevor, who's always trying to get Wonder Woman to marry him, you see that glowing sphere on the left-hand side? This is some kind of magical sphere that allows him to beam his brain energy into his muscles to make him really strong like Wonder Woman. Brain energy, it's comic books, people. So he's become real strong. He's trying to dominate Wonder Woman. She's not sure how she feels about it. Do I like it? I don't know. But she realizes at the end that she can never love a dominant man who's stronger than I am. And Steve Trevor, good boy that he is, smashes the magic crystal and goes back to his normal strength. And all is right with the world. Right? Here, as again a common theme of male domination, right? This woman is saying, submitting to a cruel husband's domination has ruined my life. And Wonder Woman's advice: get strong, earn your own living, fight for your country, right? The message here is the evils of male domination and the strength of women. Right? And again, it comes right out of the psychological work, right? If love is recognized for what it is, it means that the male can never obtain a place of real superiority in love except by learning to become more submissive in proportion to his dominance than is woman. The pleasure of submission and the evils of male domination, again, are the real message of this story, right? Ivar reasserts his domination and all kinds of bad hijinks ensue. Last trope I want to tell you about tonight that comes from the early Wonder Woman comics has to do with the kind of overall theology or cosmology behind Marston's Wonder Woman. Marston's Wonder Woman, the Amazon Society, is basically an ancient Greek society that's survived into the modern day. But unlike the Greek mythology we know of, Marston's version of the mythology is a kind of Manichaean struggle between Ares, the god of war, the representation of the masculine, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, the representation of the feminine, right? And so this is a sort of, this panel captures a structural theme of the comics. Ares trying to get men to rule the world with the sword, Aphrodite trying to get her women to conquer men with love, right? And for the Amazons, Aphrodite acts as the kind of ultimate love leader, right? So you imagine Amazon society is organized through this principle of love leadership. If Queen Hippolyta, Queen of the Amazons, is the love leader of Amazonian society, Aphrodite is the ultimate love leader for Hippolyta and everyone else in the Amazon society. And so we often see scenes where Aphrodite appears in person to sort of lovingly guide the Amazons through their troubles. Here's an example of that. Okay, so to conclude, right, what we have in the case of William Moulton Marston is, on the one hand, the significant influence of values, in his case, radical feminist values, on scientific research. And on the other hand, innovative ways in which scientific research can influence our values, our culture, our society through these kinds of applications, through applications to popular culture in particular. Before I finish, I just want to say a few thank yous. A big thank you to Jill Lepore, who, again, I just want to say this is a wonderful book that she published last year. It's been a huge aid to my research. If you came to this talk knowing anything about William Marston, it's because either you're in my class or because you've read this book or one of her essays on this topic in recent magazine articles. There's actually been an explosion of work on Wonder Woman in the last year or so. These 5 books have all been published in the last 18 months. And there's a lot of focus in them on the Marston story. So it's a very exciting time to be thinking about Wonder Woman. She's also going to be in a movie, I hear, so that's great too. Though none of these books does a great job of interpreting the scientific work, and I think what I'm trying to do is fill that gap. I also want to thank Magda Groman and Dennis Kratz, without both of whom the Center for Values would not be possible, right, through their efforts and their contributions. I especially want to thank my wonderful partner, Sabrina Starneman, who probably wishes I wouldn't mention her after this whole talk. But through a series of events I won't bore you with, Sabrina actually led me to learn about this whole topic, right? And lastly, to our wonderful daughter and her love of Wonder Woman, which she came at independently, which is very inspirational. Okay. Thank you.
We have time and expect questions.
Yeah. So if you raise your hand, and I guess Magda will come around and ask and hand you the microphone.
Hi, how are you?
I'm
Thank
okay.
you for that talk. Actually, I will admit that I have heard early versions of this.
Okay.
And I love all the new stuff that you,
Okay.
I was like really excited about it. One of the things you've got me thinking about though, as you talk about the influence of values on his scientific research and then the influence of his scientific research on his values, I kept coming back to that moment that you talked about fairly early on about his being blacklisted
Right.
from academic work.
Right.
And I wonder if you have some thoughts about, people who work openly
Right.
in that interplay between values and science and sort of the precarious position it puts them in professionally.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Jessica. It's absolutely crucial that we become more explicit about the need to think about values in the context of science, and then the role that values actually do play, right? But on the other hand, I'm not sure if this is what's happening in the Marston case, but we do see in a lot of cases that doing that kind of work can get you marginalized within the scientific community, right? I think that ultimately the thing that's going to have to change is the culture of science, right? I think scientists by and large are becoming more and more willing to acknowledge that science is a values-driven enterprise, but not so willing to be explicit in the actual practice of science of how that works. I think it's not something that young scientists should be leading the charge on, right? But something that the very prominent scientists should become vocal about, especially in areas of research that are deeply connected to public interests, right? Research on gender, research on things like climate change are areas where values are really important, and scientists need to be talking about that. I think it would create more public trust in science, actually, if they were more explicit about those issues. Yeah, thank you.
Here. One and then two. I'll make you walk.
This might be slightly unrelated, but I'm reading a book right now, and it talked about research done, I think it was in the 20s in France, about this thing called a superconscience. And it was kind of, again, in retaliation to Freud, and how we not only have a subconscious, but a superconscious that we can follow. And I don't know if you can tell me a little bit more about that, because it didn't really go into depth.
So I'm actually not familiar with that research, although I think that's interesting. The super conscious, I don't know about that. I'm sorry.
So my question is that going over this talk, you talked a lot about his theories on men and women and dominance and submission. And the thing is that one of the things that kind of struck me is that I'm not sure if this was just because of the time period, but he really has, in some ways, a strangely kind of traditional understanding of relationships. Because did Moulton Marston say anything about homosexual relationships? Did he talk anything about man and man or woman and woman? Because, I read somewhere that, after he died, both of the women that he was involved with, moved in together and maintained a relationship. And there's kind of, kind of this, maybe they were into each other as well, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's hard to speculate about those details of his personal life beyond, the few details that we know. But we do know that they lived together long after his death, until Olive died in the, I want to say, 1980s. So Marston does say a few things about homosexuality, and it is an odd mix of progressive and regressive thoughts. He's very positive about same-sex relationships between women, right? Where you have all the necessary ingredients for loving relationships, right? He is less so about he's less positive about relationships between men, and I don't know if that's his own sort of historically situated squeamishness or where that's coming from. But the things he says strike one as kind of unfortunately traditional for the time period about male gay relationships. Yeah. But he studied prisoners, right, where he saw examples of both. So he did a long study with prisoners and their relationships. So man on man and woman on woman relationships, and it's a strange part of the work. I don't think it's a particularly good part of what he had to say. Yeah.
Right here. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, first I have to admit, prior to coming here, I was oblivious as to who Marston was, and to hear about a male feminist was pretty surprising for me. And my question is, well, first I'd like to elaborate by saying that I'm assuming that the reason why he was a male feminist was because of the time period, again, reiterating what he was saying. But my question would be, would you think, hypothetically speaking, if he were to live today, would you think he's made somewhat of an impact to society, or are there still issues that he would want to resolve to this day regarding his radical feminism?
Oh, yeah, good question. Well, I mean, so it's actually remarkable how early he gets his feminist views. So Jill Lepore in her book relates a story about his involvement in a debate about women's suffrage, I think in high school, right? So it's a very it's something he picked up on very early. If he were writing today, I mean, we don't live in a matriarchy, so he wouldn't be satisfied, right? We don't even really live in a society, we still basically live in a society of patriarchy, so he'd be even less satisfied with that. Although I have a hard time believing that if he, had the benefit of the subsequent history of work both in psychology and in feminist theory, I don't really believe he could have held on to his strong sort of biological essentialism about men and women that he had at this time. So I think it would be hard for him to come to the views that he had then, today, right? And we wouldn't want to, pick up on that element of his work. Uh-oh, Fred Grinnell.
Yeah, so I just have one question for you, or actually two questions. With this, I'll just mention the second one first, and that is that I noticed that all four of the new books are by men. So I wonder, aren't a lot of, so are there not a lot of women writing about Wonder Woman?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Yeah.
And you're going to be the fifth, and so.
Most of the women have written about Wonder Woman, write about Wonder Woman in the context of a bunch of other things, right? So for example, Jen Stuller's book, which I mentioned briefly, talks about the whole tradition, both in comics and film, of female superheroines. It is interesting. I don't really know what to make of that.
All right. So somehow I don't think Wonder Woman would approve of having a family structure with sort of a harem. And yeah. I don't get. Yeah. It seems very contradictory to me, the way he lived versus what he was writing about. Yeah. And I wonder if somehow the writing about taking the feminist style of writing was kind of compensation or a way of making up for the way he was actually living his life, which seems to me just the opposite.
Right. Yeah, so the obvious reading of the personal life stuff is that it is an awkward fit with the theory, the philosophy, right, the psychology. And certainly in the book, this is something that Jill Lepore makes a big deal out of, right? That basically there's this deep inconsistency between Marston's family life, which she says is very much not a matriarchy, and his thought, his written, spoken thought. So I mean, one of the questions that I think is open for me is there a feminist reading of polyamory or polygamy of the kind that Marston had, right? So, and I don't know the answer to that question, but some thoughts, Elizabeth Marston worked her whole life, right? Barely took any break, even when she had children, and seemed to really, really like it, right? And was able to support the family when Marston was basically blacklisted and unable to work in his field. So there's that, right? There is some evidence that they try to apply the whole concept of love leadership in their personal life through what's kind of comes out of the meetings with Carolyn Keatley and that Age of Aquarius kind of group that they were a part of for a time. I'm not sure if you can stitch that together into a reading that fits what Marston says. I kind of doubt it. You could just leave this up to, he didn't practice what he preached. You could try to develop some speculations or resources for trying to read it in a very different way. And I've seen, like Noah Berlatsky in his book tries to do a little bit of that. It's tricky. It's a big question mark in the scholarship on Marston for sure.
So on the subject of trying to think about a different reading for that question, this just kind of popped into my head, was the idea that it's more of the idea of like the harem or that kind of relationship presupposes kind of a patriarchal setup for it. So just the reading it as him not practicing what he preaches is assuming that he was the dominant one in that relationship.
It does assume that, yeah.
And I don't know if we know whether or not there's any evidence one way or the other there.
I don't think we know. I don't think it. I mean, it's. I'm kind of a little uncomfortable with speculating about it, so yeah, I don't know that we know. I don't know that we know.
Hello.
Hi.
You can see me. My main question is how he basically sticks with very structured gender roles for men. He even states that they are incapable of what he terms active love.
Yeah.
And how basically do you think that just stems from how he was raised before being introduced to feminism and his own feelings of limitations about him and other men in general?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. I mean, it seems to me like, in some ways, his views about so he does have kind of very essentialized notions of the roles for men and women. Does that come from the way he was raised? Again, I don't think that we know enough about the way that he was raised to really say. He was an only child, right? And by the very thin accounts that I've seen, somewhat doted upon, right? So you could make some kind of notion of that. So you can try to make something out of that, but it's really difficult. I mean, it's really difficult to dig into these aspects of personal life, especially since the Marston clan was kind of tight-lipped about things, right? It's only through very detailed archival work and doing a lot of work making relationships with members of the Marston family who survive today that Jill Lepore was able to do what she did in her book. And even then, I don't think she presents enough evidence to make really strong conclusions about what his personal life was really like in some of these ways. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Matt. Maybe you could talk a little bit about his concept of the normal emotions, and particularly because the response that I had to the term was one that suggested that the term would be a sociological one, right? That normality is something that is a set of values that are to be defined and can be studied empirically. And at the same time, like the Kinsey report is doing something with normal sexuality that's basically committed to this idea of a kind of empirical study of norms. So his idea of normal, he rejects convention, he rejects every kind of social norm, and then, but he insists on holding to the terminology of normality. That his vision of what something is, what normal is. So maybe you can sort of address that sort of way of thinking. Maybe it's rooted in his essentialism. I don't.
Yeah, I think it ultimately is, right. So for Marston, normal is not, as we saw in this quote, it's not statistical norm. It's not cultural norm. In a way, it's the norm of healthiness, right? What does it take for the mind to be healthy? And that comes out of a neuroscientifically informed, experimentally informed sense of what it takes to be in a healthy state. It's very tricky because he comes to the view that he lives in a highly abnormal society, right? He's in the awkward position of saying basically that, everyone else in society is crazy and he's the sane one, right? Or at least he knows what sanity looks like. So his concept of what's normative comes. It comes out of what is essential to the functioning of the human organism, right? That's where it comes from, and he thinks that has to be figured out in this pretty roundabout way because there aren't a lot of normal people to study or a lot of healthy people to study.
Thank you for this talk. It really raised the question for me, stepping back from Marston, the whole notion of feminism and the whole notion of a utopian society. For me, the idea of a utopian society is moving outside of violence, moving outside of us and them, and yet the definition of utopia is really the struggle between dominance and submission in this case. And do you see has anyone looked at any studies of, well, what would a utopian society look like, and is there a matriarchal example of women together living in peace?
Yeah, good question. So let me start by suggesting a revision of the question because I think it's crucially it's an easy misunderstanding, but it's a crucially problematic misunderstanding of Marston to read it as dominance and submission, right? You got to have the four categories because really domination and submission don't even belong together, right? We want to read them together because that's sort of common sense language or whatever kind of language. That's common currency. But for him, right, submission is not this antagonistic state, right? You submit to someone because you love them and trust them and they're simpatico with where you want to go, right? So Marston's utopia is one that is non-antagonistic, right? In that respect. Are there examples of this kind of thing in the real world succeeding, or other thoughts about what a feminist utopia would look like? No, not really. Nothing that's really relevant here. I mean, there are matriarchal societies. Historically, it's always quite a bit complicated. You can learn about these things by doing a little research. But they're not reflections of the kind of thing that Marston was really thinking about. If anything, the kind of sort of prototypes in Marston's mind for this kind of society, which influenced the Amazonian society and Wonder Woman, were things like Her Land, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, or Angel Island, I think that's Inez Gilmore, as the woman who wrote that. These are kind of the gynocentric utopias that were written that Marston would have possibly been familiar with. So, thank you for the question.